What happens when the hollow arrogance of new money collides with the quiet resilience of an old soul? In the heart of Boston, a city that prides itself on history and substance, 23-year-old Eleanor Vance is about to discover the brutal answer. For her, life is a carefully budgeted marathon toward a cherished dream. For Julian Croft, the 25-year-old heir to a tech fortune that materialized seemingly overnight, life is a series of transactions with no emotional cost. One crisp autumn evening, their two worlds don't just collide, they shatter against each other in a storm of contempt and cruelty. The weapon of choice? Not a plate of food, but a cold, hard stack of $100 bills used to purchase a woman's humiliation. But this is not the story of a spirit broken by shame. It is the story of what transpired the following day, when the architect of that fortune, the formidable Arthur Croft, appeared not with a simple apology, but with a challenge that would redefine power, penance, and the true meaning of ownership. The reason why will dismantle every notion you have about wealth and worth. Julian Croft navigated a world buffered by the friction of consequence. At 25, he was the sole inheritor of the Croft Innovations empire, a sprawling behemoth of software and AI development built from the ground up by his relentless father, Arthur. But Julian didn't see the architecture of the empire. He only saw the penthouse view it afforded him. His existence was a meticulously curated highlight reel of indulgence. Rooftop bars where the cocktails cost more than a weekly grocery bill, impromptu ski trips to Aspen on the company jet, and a revolving door of acolytes. Chad, a venture capitalist wannabe with a predatory smile, and Tiffany, a social media influencer whose personality was sponsored by luxury brands. Tonight's stage for his casual theater of superiority was Aurelia, a restaurant so steeped in old-world elegance that its name was whispered in reverent tones among the city's elite. The ambiance was one of hushed significance. Mahogany-paneled walls, gas lamps flickering softly, and staff who moved with a silent, almost telepathic efficiency. Julian held court at a prime table overlooking the public garden, the autumn leaves a fiery backdrop to his monologue. The sommelier looked at me as if I'd just asked for ketchup with the Chateau Margaux, Julian sneered, swirling the deep garnet wine in his glass. As if his entire purpose in life isn't to pour fermented grape juice for people who could buy his entire dreary little life with the interest from their trust fund. Chad chuckled on cue, a practiced, sycophantic sound. He should be thanking you for the education, Jay. Most people in his position never get to see a bottle like that. Tiffany, preoccupied with angling her phone to capture the perfect shimmering reflection in her wine glass, added without looking up. Totally. The vibe here is getting so provincial. Their waitress, Eleanor Vance, heard the remark as she approached, a heavy silver tray balanced expertly on one hand. She kept her face a mask of serene neutrality, a placid calm she had cultivated over 5 years in the demanding world of fine dining. At 23, Ellie wasn't serving pan-seared scallops with saffron risotto out of a deep-seated passion for gastronomy. She was doing it out of a fierce, unwavering devotion to a dream. Her world was a universe away from the gilded cage of the Croft heir. It was a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Somerville, shared with her grandmother, Clara, a woman whose hands, though gnarled with arthritis, could still remember the precise feel of perfectly proofed dough. That apartment was a temporary shelter, a waypoint on a long journey home. The destination was a small, shuttered storefront in the North End with a faded sign that read, "The Rolling Pin." It was her family's bakery, run by 3 generations of Vances, before a combination of her grandfather's medical bills and a predatory loan had forced them to sell it a decade ago. Every dollar Ellie earned, every meticulously recorded tip, went into a savings account she'd named the Dough Fund. She was agonizingly close to having enough for a down payment to buy it back, to restore the legacy that had been stolen from them. "Is everything to your satisfaction this evening?" Ellie asked, her voice a model of professional grace, as she placed a small plate of artisanal bread and cultured butter on the table. Julian didn't deign to look at her. He gestured dismissively at the bread. "This bread. What is it? Sourdough?" "Yes, sir. It's a naturally leavened sourdough, baked for us by a local artisan bakery. It's dense," he declared, poking it with a fork as if dissecting a lab specimen. And the butter's too cold. It's unspreadable. Is the chef not aware that butter needs to be served at room temperature for the fat molecules to properly emulsify? It's basic. Ellie's professional smile remained fixed, but a tiny, imperceptible muscle in her jaw tightened. She knew the butter was perfect. It was from a small Vermont creamery, and she herself had checked its temperature before service. This wasn't a complaint. It was a test, a power play. I do apologize, sir. I can bring you another portion immediately. Don't bother, Julian waved his hand, his voice laced with the theatrical boredom of a man who enjoyed creating problems more than solving them. I've lost my appetite for it, just as I'm losing my appetite for this entire experience. The venom in his tone made Chad and Tiffany exchange a quick, eager glance. The evening's entertainment was about to begin. Of course, sir, Ellie said, her own heart rate picking up. She recognized his type intimately, the customer who didn't seek a solution, but a spectacle, a victim to validate their own importance. I will inform the manager of your dissatisfaction. We will, of course, remove the bread service charge from your bill. Remove the charge? Julian finally looked up, his eyes a cold, pale blue, utterly devoid of warmth or empathy. You think this is about the $2 you charge for bread? I could buy this entire restaurant and have it bulldozed by noon tomorrow if I felt like it. This is about a standard of excellence. It's about competence. It's about a fundamental understanding of the service industry, something you clearly lack. The humiliation was a prickling heat crawling up Ellie's neck. She could feel the curious gazes of the surrounding tables. She thought of her grandmother waiting up for her, the worn photograph of the rolling pin in its heyday that sat on her nightstand. That was real. This was just a spoiled child, drunk on unearned power. I understand, sir. My apologies, she repeated, her voice a little more brittle this time. But Julian wasn't finished. He craved a finale. He wanted a story he could embellish for weeks. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thick money clip, peeling off a stack of crisp $100 bills. Ellie watched, confused, as he counted out 10 of them. You know what I think? He said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the hushed room. I think you're new here. I think you're in over your head. I think you probably need the money more than this restaurant needs your subpar service. With a look of utter disdain, he didn't just place the money on the table. He leaned forward and with a flick of his wrist, he threw the wad of cash directly at her. The bills scattered, some hitting her chest and fluttering to the floor around her feet like oversized, insulting confetti. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the dining room. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, broken only by Tiffany's nervous, quickly suppressed titter. Ellie stood frozen, shock giving way to a tidal wave of ice-cold rage and profound shame. The crinkled faces of Benjamin Franklin seemed to mock her from the plush carpet. She looked down at the money, then back up at Julian's smug, triumphant face. In that instant, she saw him not as a titan of industry, but as something small and hollow, a boy desperately screaming for attention in a room full of adults. The mask of professional serenity did not just crack, it vaporized. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her voice when it came was low, steady, and trembled with a fury so controlled it was more terrifying than any outburst. I hope that purchase made you feel powerful, she said, holding his gaze without flinching. Because from where I'm standing, it just looks pathetic. Without waiting for his response, and without stooping to pick up a single bill, she turned on her heel and walked away. She moved with a straight-back dignity that was, in itself, an act of defiance, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence and the faint, cloying scent of entitlement. She didn't see the restaurant manager, Bernard, a man whose spine was rumored to be on the restaurant's payroll, scurrying to Julian's table, bowing and profusely apologizing to him. She didn't hear Julian laugh it off, telling Bernard, "Don't worry about it. Just have someone clean up my tip and make sure she's gone before I get my entrees. She's clearly not Aurelia material." She was already in the staff changing room, her hands shaking as she unbuttoned her uniform. The tears of fury finally came, hot and silent, as she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She hadn't just lost a job. She had been publicly priced, appraised, and dismissed like an object. And the cost of her humiliation was $1,000 left on the floor. The meeting in Bernard's office was as brief as it was degrading. The manager, a man who polished his words for the wealthy and sharpened them for the staff, couldn't meet her eye. He focused on arranging a set of pens on his desk into a perfect sterile line. "Eleanor, we have a standard of decorum at Aurelia," he began, his voice smooth and detached. "Our clientele expects a certain frictionless experience. Your interaction with Mr. Croft was unacceptable." "He threw money in my face," Ellie stated, her voice flat with disbelief. "And your response was insubordinate and inflammatory," Bernard countered, finally looking up. His eyes were cold and reptilian. "The Croft family are significant patrons. In this business, the customer is always right, especially that customer. It's best for all parties if we terminate your employment, effective immediately." He slid a final paycheck across the desk. It did not include severance. It was an execution, not a negotiation. Ellie took the envelope without a word. Arguing was pointless. In Julian Croft's world, gravity itself bent to his will. She was just a minor satellite, easily knocked from orbit. She changed into her street clothes, leaving the perfectly pressed Aurelia uniform folded on a bench, a relic from a life that had ended an hour ago. The walk to the subway station was a blur. The vibrant city lights of Boston seemed to mock her, each gleam a reminder of a world of wealth and power she could only ever serve, never join. When she finally unlocked the door to her apartment, the comforting aroma of chamomile tea and old books enveloped her. Her grandmother, Clara, sat in her favorite armchair, a well-worn copy of The Joy of Cooking, open on her lap. She was a small woman, but she possessed a formidable stillness. One look at Ellie's face, the rigid set of her jaw, the storm in her eyes, was all Clara needed. "Oh, my dear girl," she said softly, her voice raspy with age and wisdom. "What did that place do to you?" The story came tumbling out, a torrent of carefully chosen words, of sneering condescension, and the final, brutal act of financial violation. Clara listened without interruption, her gnarled fingers tightening on the arms of her chair until her knuckles were white. When Ellie finished, the old woman was silent for a long moment. "In my day," Clara said, her voice a low, dangerous hum, "men with no character had the decency to be ashamed of it. Now they display it like a medal." She looked at Ellie, her eyes sharp and clear. "You did not let him break your dignity. That is a victory, Eleanor. Do not ever forget that." "It doesn't feel like a victory, Nana. It feels like the end. The bakery. I was so close." "A dream deferred is not a dream destroyed," Clara said, her voice firm. "This is just a chapter, not the whole story." Meanwhile, across the Charles River, in a penthouse that scraped the clouds, the incident was being spun into an amusing anecdote. Julian, fueled by more wine, recounted a heavily edited version to Chad and Tiffany. In his telling, he was the calm, benevolent patron dealing with a hysterical, incompetent waitress who had tried to scam him. The money wasn't an insult. It was a generous severance package he'd bestowed upon her out of pity. By the next morning, a sanitized version of the story had already made its way onto a private social blog for Boston's elite, painting Julian as a magnanimous young tycoon, handling an unfortunate staff issue with class and discretion. To Julian, the waitress was already a ghost, a nameless face in a long line of minor inconveniences he had simply paid to make disappear. He had already forgotten her name, but the story had another life, an unvarnished one. A young busboy, a student at UMass Boston, who had witnessed the entire exchange, was appalled. He quietly recorded a short video on his phone of Ellie walking away and the money scattered on the floor before Bernard had it swept up. That night, he wrote a detailed, anonymous email to a veteran investigative journalist at the Boston Globe, a woman renowned for her unflinching exposés on the abuses of power within the city's gilded circles. He attached the video. It wasn't high quality, but it was damning. It showed the money. It showed the stunned faces of the other patrons. It told a very different story from the one being whispered in the country clubs. The journalist, her interest piqued by the stark contrast between the society blog's fairy tale and the busboy's gritty account. began to make some calls. The minor inconvenience the ghost Julian Croft had tried to erase was about to materialize into a very real problem, and it was heading directly for the unbreachable fortress of Croft Innovations. Arthur Croft had not constructed a billion-dollar empire from a garage startup by being oblivious. At 62, he was a man forged in the fires of discipline and relentless observation. His office, occupying the entire top floor of the Croft Tower in the Seaport District, was a testament to his philosophy: minimalist, functional, and brutally efficient. There was a single massive desk made from reclaimed factory timber and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city he had, in many ways, conquered. From this perch, he monitored everything. He tracked global markets, server uptime, and the subtle shifts in venture capital with the same hawk-like intensity. He also monitored his son. Arthur loved Julian, but it was a love increasingly shadowed by a profound and weary disappointment. He saw the brilliant, inquisitive boy he had raised, the one who had built his first computer at age 12, slowly being consumed by a caricature of wealth. Julian had become arrogant, lazy, and dangerously insulated from the cause and effect reality that governed the rest of the world. Arthur had given his son every advantage, but in doing so, he feared he had deprived him of the one thing that had built his own character: meaningful struggle. Arthur's own story was a well-guarded legend. The son of a union steelworker from Pittsburgh, he had worked his way through MIT as a janitor and a short-order cook. He understood the sting of condescension, the weight of a dismissive glance from those who had been born into privilege. He had built his empire on the core belief that value was created through work, not inheritance. He learned of the incident at Aurelia, not from a blog or a news report, but from a single encrypted text message. It was from a man named David Chen, his head of security, a quiet, unassuming man who was far more than a bodyguard. Chen's primary role was to be Arthur's eyes and ears, to gather information and neutralize threats, both external and internal. The text contained a link to the busboy's email and video, which Chen's digital intelligence team had already intercepted. Sir, an incident at Aurelia last night involving Julian. A waitress was terminated. The attached is a witness account and video. A reporter from the Globe is now making inquiries. This has the potential to become a significant brand liability. Arthur clicked the link. He read the raw, unfiltered account of his son's behavior, the manufactured complaint, the public belittling, and the final vulgar act of throwing money at a working woman. He watched the grainy video, seeing the scattered bills on the floor. It was a tableau of such crude and thoughtless power that it made him physically ill. It wasn't the potential for a public relations scandal that enraged him. His formidable legal and PR teams could suffocate a story like that in a matter of hours. It was the sheer, pointless cruelty of the act. It was a deep moral rot, a betrayal of every value he had tried to instill in his son. This was the behavior of a feudal lord, not the leader of a forward-thinking technology company. He leaned back in his chair, the city glittering below him, a kingdom built on logic and innovation. But at that moment, all he felt was the chilling, personal sting of failure. This was his heir, his legacy, and he was behaving like a villain from a bad movie. "David," Arthur spoke into his phone, his voice a low growl, "get me a comprehensive file on this waitress, Eleanor Vance. I want her entire life story, education, family, work history, financial situation, everything. And I want to know everything about Aurelia's manager, Bernard. I want to know if he cheats on his taxes." "Right away, sir." "And David," Arthur added, his voice dropping even lower, "I want you to purchase the commercial property Aurelia leases, the entire building. Use a shell corporation. I don't care what it costs. I want the deal closed by morning. I want to be Bernard's landlord before he's had his morning coffee." "Consider it done, sir." For the next hour, Arthur sat in the growing twilight, not moving, simply staring out at the city. The hot flash of anger had subsided, replaced by an icy, calculated resolve. He had been too patient, too hopeful that Julian would eventually mature. He had been wrong. His son wasn't just drifting. He was actively cultivating a monstrous persona, shielded from the world by the very fortune Arthur had created. The time for hope was over. The time for a radical intervention had arrived. The digital dossier arrived on his encrypted tablet less than 90 minutes later. Chen's work was, as always, impeccable and devastatingly thorough. He read about Eleanor Vance, a summa cum laude graduate in business administration from Boston College, her perfect service record at 3 different high-end restaurants, her role as primary caregiver for her grandmother, Clara. Then he came to the section titled Familial History. He read about the Rolling Pin Bakery, its history, its beloved status in the North End, and the financial tragedy that had led to its closure. He saw the name of the savings account, the Doe Fund, and the meticulous record of deposits. He saw how close she was. A feeling Arthur hadn't experienced in decades resonated in his chest. It was the ghost of his own past, the memory of watching his own father's pride crumble after the steel mills closed, the quiet desperation of a family with immense dignity and no capital. This young woman, Eleanor, wasn't just a victim of his son's casual cruelty. She was fighting the same battle he had fought, and his own flesh and blood, a boy who had never known a day of true financial worry, had tried to extinguish her fighting spirit for sport. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was not a problem to be managed with a press release and a quiet settlement. This was an opportunity to salvage what was left of his son's character, to right a profound wrong, and to teach a lesson so visceral and unforgettable, it would either forge Julian into a man or shatter his pathetic illusions completely. He picked up his phone again. "David, I need you to arrange a meeting, not with my son, with Miss Vance, here, in my office, tomorrow at 9 a.m., and make sure Bernard, the manager from Aurelia, is waiting in the lobby at 8:30. I'd like a word with him first." There was a brief pause. "Will you require a security detail for Mr. Bernard's departure, sir?" Chen asked. "No, David," Arthur replied, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time that evening. "I suspect he'll be leaving quite willingly." The next morning, Eleanor Vance, dressed in the most professional outfit she owned, a simple black dress in a worn but well-kept blazer, walked into the gleaming, intimidating lobby of the Croft Tower. A polite but firm assistant met her and escorted her to a private elevator. She felt a knot of dread in her stomach. This had to be about a settlement, about buying her silence. She had already rehearsed her refusal in her head 100 times. When the elevator doors opened directly into Arthur Croft's office, she was taken aback by the stark simplicity of the space and the commanding presence of the man standing by the window. He was older than in his photos, with a face etched by intensity rather than age. He turned to face her, and his eyes, unlike his son's, were not cold. They were like molten steel, fiery, sharp, and assessing. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a deep baritone that held no hint of condescension. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Ellie sat, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I will not be signing a non-disclosure agreement, Mr. Croft," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. Arthur raised a hand. "I have no intention of offering you one. As I said to my head of security last night, your silence is the last thing I want." He walked around his desk and sat opposite her, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I have read a detailed report of the events at Aurelia," he said. "I have seen the video. There are no words of apology that could adequately address my son's behavior. It was a failure not just of character, but of his upbringing, a failure that is ultimately my responsibility." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "So I am not here to offer you money to make this go away. I am here to make a business proposal." Ellie stared at him, bewildered. "A business proposal?" "Yes. I've spent the last 12 hours learning about you, Miss Vance. I know about your degree from BC. I know about your impeccable work history. And I know about the rolling pin." Ellie's composure faltered for the first time. Hearing the name of her family's bakery in this sterile corporate fortress felt like a violation. "You're a person of substance, of grit," Arthur continued. "The kind of person I built this company by hiring. My son, on the other hand, is a liability. He understands the price of everything and the value of nothing. It's time he learned the difference." He slid a thick folder across the desk. Ellie's name was printed on the tab. "As of 7 a.m. this morning, the holding company that owns the building Aurelia occupies is a subsidiary of Croft Innovations. I had a conversation with your former manager, Bernard, an hour ago. He has decided to pursue an early retirement. As of this moment, the position of general manager at Aurelia is vacant. Ellie's mind reeled, unable to process the speed and scale of the power she was witnessing. I am offering you that position, Arthur said, his voice clear and direct. You will have full operational control, a generous salary, full benefits, and a performance-based bonus structure. Your primary objective will be to restore the restaurant's integrity and make it profitable again. If you succeed within 1 year, I will grant you a 20% equity stake in the business. It will be yours. Ellie was speechless. She looked from Arthur's intense face to the folder, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was impossible. It was a dream. It had to be a trick. Why? She finally whispered. Why me? Because you've already proven you have something my son and his entire entourage lack. Character. And because you understand that business from the ground up. But, he said, raising a single finger, there is one condition, a non-negotiable one. Ellie braced herself. You must hire a new employee. He will start at the very bottom. His first role will be assistant cellarman and busboy. He will be responsible for inventorying the wine, stocking the bars, polishing silverware, and clearing tables. He will work double shifts 6 days a week for minimum wage, and he will report directly to you. Arthur leaned back, letting the weight of his words fill the room. His name is Julian Croft. The sheer, audacious brilliance of the plan struck Ellie like a physical force. It was not mere punishment. It was a perfectly engineered crucible, a karmic realignment of staggering proportions. She would not be a recipient of charity. She would be an agent of consequence. Julian wouldn't be sent to some fictional boot camp. He would be forced to inhabit the very world he had so arrogantly despised. And she, the woman he had tried to humiliate, would be his boss, his gatekeeper, his ever-present reminder of what true work looked like. You want me to be your son's warden, she said, testing the shape of the unbelievable reality. I want you to be his teacher, Arthur corrected, his voice firm. I don't want you to be cruel. I want you to be fair. I want you to hold him to the same high standard you hold for yourself. I want him to see, day in and day out, what it means to earn a living, to build something of value. His education begins now. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The choice is yours, Miss Vance. You can refuse, and I will understand completely. I will still ensure you are compensated for your troubles, and I will personally finance the repurchase of your family's bakery. No strings attached. My son, however, will have learned nothing. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond the shrewd businessman. She saw a father's desperate last-ditch hope. Ellie thought of Julian's sneering face. She thought of the money fluttering to the floor. Then she thought of the smell of baking bread, of her grandmother's proud smile, of the faded sign for the rolling pin. This wasn't just about justice. It was about legacy, his and hers. She stood and extended her hand. Its grip was firm, unwavering. All right, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority in the cavernous office. When does my new busboy start? The first day was a master class in controlled chaos. Ellie walked into Aurelia not as a waitress, but as its new general manager. The staff, who had whispered about her firing the night before, stared in stunned silence as she called a full team meeting in the main dining room. Bernard was gone, and the woman they had pitied was now in charge. Her speech was brief and direct. She acknowledged the unusual circumstances of her appointment. She didn't mention Julian Croft by name. She simply stated that Aurelia had lost its way, focusing more on catering to egos than on creating exceptional experiences. Her mission, she explained, was to restore its soul, and that would require dedication, professionalism, and a renewed focus on the craft of hospitality. She was firm, fair, and radiated a competence that slowly began to cut through the staff's bewildered skepticism. Julian arrived precisely at noon, as instructed. He wasn't delivered by a chauffeur, but by a taxi, which he paid for with the last of the cash in his wallet. His father had been brutally efficient. His credit cards were declined, his bank accounts frozen. He was dressed in a designer cashmere sweater and trousers that cost more than Ellie's monthly rent. He strode in through the front entrance, a thunderous expression on his face, clearly expecting a final confrontation, a negotiation. Ellie met him in the foyer. She was holding a neatly folded plain black uniform. "You're late," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "And you're using the wrong entrance. Staff uses the back alley. You're also out of dress code." Julian stared at her, then at the uniform, his face a mask of incredulous rage. "This is insane. This is some kind of sick, twisted game my father is playing. I am not wearing that. I am not working here." "That is certainly your choice," Ellie replied calmly, glancing at her watch. "Your shift started 10 minutes ago. If you choose not to work, you will be terminated for cause, in which case you will have to find your own way to pay for your penthouse, your car, and your next meal. The choice is yours. Now the staff changing room is downstairs. Be on the floor in 5 minutes, or don't bother." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the opulent foyer. The reality of his situation, stark and terrifying, began to sink in. He was trapped, defeated, and for the first time in his life, utterly powerless. He snatched the uniform and stormed toward the basement. His first shift was a descent into a special kind of hell. The head sommelier, a formidable Frenchman named Jean-Pierre, who had loathed Julian's entitled pronouncements on wine for years, took a particular malicious glee in his new role as Julian's supervisor. He was tasked with inventorying thousands of bottles in the dusty, cramped cellar, his soft, uncalloused hands quickly becoming raw from handling heavy wooden crates. Later, he was sent to the main floor as a busboy. Under Ellie's watchful eye, he cleared dishes, his movements clumsy and awkward. He, who had sent back plates for the most minor of imperfections, was now scraping leftover food into a bin. The other staff ignored him, treating him with a cold, professional detachment that was more isolating than open hostility. The patrons, his former peers, stared at him. Some smirked, some whispered. Each glance was a fresh humiliation. This became his new reality. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. The work was grueling, monotonous, and the first 60 days were an exercise in the slow, grinding erosion of a soul. Julian's world, once a boundless horizon of instantaneous gratification, had shrunk to the four walls of the Aurelia basement. It was a subterranean kingdom of steam, bleach, and the rhythmic, percussive clang of metal on metal. His hands, once soft and accustomed only to the weight of a champagne flute or the leather of a steering wheel, were now a cartography of small pains. Blisters that tore and bled, calluses that formed like armor, and a perpetual ache in the knuckles from gripping mop handles and heavy crates. He learned the geography of humility. It was the precise angle at which to scrape congealed béarnaise sauce from a porcelain plate without splashing his uniform. It was the burn in his thighs from hauling cases of San Pellegrino up 2 flights of stairs because the service elevator was broken. It was the practiced invisibility required to navigate a crowded dining room, a ghost who existed only to remove the evidence of other people's pleasure. His old life haunted him in phantom sounds. The pop of a cork, the easy laughter of men who discussed 7-figure deals over dessert, sounds that now served only to highlight the chasm between his past and his present. Eleanor, meanwhile, waged a war on a different front. She inherited a restaurant with a gilded reputation and a rotten core. Bernard had been a master of appearances, but the restaurant's finances were a tangled mess of vanity projects and kickback schemes with suppliers. Morale was a ghost. The staff, accustomed to a culture of fear and favoritism, watched her with the wary eyes of a colony animal assessing a new predator. They tested her, subtly at first, then with more open defiance. She met it all with a preternatural calm that was in itself an immense performance. Inside, she was a maelstrom of anxiety. She lived on black coffee and 4 hours of sleep, her dreams populated by spreadsheets with bleeding red ink and the phantom taste of failure. The weight of Arthur Croft's gamble was a physical pressure behind her eyes. She wasn't just managing a restaurant. She was the fulcrum of a man's desperate attempt to salvage his son's humanity. If she failed, she wouldn't just lose a job. She would have failed a test she never asked to take. Their interactions were brutally sterile. Croft, table 12 needs to be cleared and reset. Yes, manager. Croft, the Riesling is running low in the service bar. On it, manager. She never used his first name. He was a function, a tool, a pair of hands. It was the only way she could maintain the necessary wall between the woman he had humiliated and the boss she had to be. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing his punishment as a personal vendetta. Her power lay in her professional indifference. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in late November, a night so frigid the city seemed to shrink in on itself. Julian, leaving through the staff exit into the narrow garbage-scented alley, saw them. Chad and Tiffany. They were climbing out of a gleaming new Maserati, laughing, heading for the bar next door. For a moment he froze, half hidden in the shadows and the steam billowing from a kitchen vent. Tiffany saw him first. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up, her laughter catching in her throat. Chad turned, his predatory smile widening with genuine, cruel delight. Julian, holy shit, is that you? Chad sauntered over, his expensive overcoat unbuttoned to reveal a silk shirt. Heard you were on some kind of work-study program. Method acting for the common man? Leave him alone, Chad, Tiffany said, though there was no force behind it. She was filming him with her phone, a subtle, practiced movement. No, this is incredible, Chad continued, circling Julian like a shark. He gestured at Julian's worn, slightly grease-stained uniform. Is that this season's couture? Very proletarian chic. Tell me, Jay, do you have to ask for a bathroom break, or do they just let you use a bucket in the back? Every muscle in Julian's body screamed. The old Julian would have ended Chad with a single, surgically cruel sentence. The old Julian would have had him blacklisted from every venture capital firm in the city by morning. But this Julian had nothing. He was a busboy in an alley. He had no power, no leverage, no armor. He just stood there, his face burning with a shame so profound it was acid in his veins. He said nothing. He simply turned his back on them and walked away into the frozen night, their mocking laughter echoing behind him like stones thrown at his back. He didn't go to his sterile corporate apartment. He walked. For hours he walked the frozen streets of Boston, the wind whipping tears from his eyes. He walked until the fury and shame burned away, leaving behind a hollow, desolate cold. He finally found himself in the empty dining room of Aurelia long after closing, where a single light burned over the manager's desk in the corner. Eleanor was there, her head in her hands, surrounded by a sea of invoices and receipts. She looked up as he entered, her expression not of annoyance, but of a weariness so deep it was startling. This time the question was different. The sneer was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged edge of despair. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Not just to me. All of this." He gestured around the empty room. "Working yourself to death. For what? So my father can win his little morality play? So you can get your pound of flesh?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in months. She saw the exhaustion that mirrored her own. She saw the cracks in the marble facade, and in that moment, the sterile wall of manager and Croft crumbled. "You think this is about you?" she said, her voice quiet, devoid of its usual clipped authority. "You are the least of my problems, Julian." She picked up a thick invoice. "This is from our produce supplier. He's been padding his invoices for 6 years. I just proved it. Firing him means finding a new supplier in 48 hours, or we have no salad for the weekend rush." She pointed to another stack. "That's the overtime report. 2 of my best line cooks are getting poached by a new hotel in the seaport. I can't match their offer, so I have to figure out how to run a kitchen short-staffed without the quality dropping." She stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the public garden, its trees now skeletal against the city lights. "My grandmother," she said softly, her back to him, "worked 60 hours a week for 40 years in our family's bakery. When she was my age, she already knew the names of every customer, knew which ones liked their bread a little darker, knew whose daughter was getting married and needed a cake. She didn't do it for revenge or for a morality play. She did it because when you build something, when you put your name on it, it becomes a part of you. It's a promise. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and fierce. You and your father, you think in terms of transactions, punishments and rewards, wins and losses. I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to keep a promise. I'm trying to save this place from the lazy, corrosive entitlement that you used to represent. Your suffering isn't the goal. It's just an irrelevant byproduct of the work that needs to get done. He had come for a fight, for a confrontation, for some kind of emotional release. Instead, she had handed him a mirror, and in it, he saw his own profound smallness. His pain, which had felt so monumental, so central to the universe, was, as she said, an irrelevance. The world was not a stage for his drama. It was a complex, difficult machine that required constant, painstaking work to keep from falling apart. He saw not a warden, but a woman shouldering a burden he could not even comprehend. He left without another word, the silence in the room more damning than any shout. That night marked a tectonic shift within him. The anger, the self-pity, the resentment, they didn't vanish, but they receded, replaced by a strange, new curiosity. He began to see. He saw the near telepathic communication between the veteran servers during the dinner rush. He saw the way the pastry chef's mood could dictate the quality of the entire dessert service. He saw Eleanor tasting a spoonful of demi-glace and telling the saucier it needed 3 more minutes, and he saw the flicker of respect in the older man's eyes when he realized she was right. He was witnessing a language he had never known existed, the language of competence. His work changed. It became less about enduring and more about understanding. In the wine cellar, a place he had initially despised, he found a quiet sanctuary. He started reading the labels, not just as names to be inventoried, but as stories. He learned the difference between the terroir of Burgundy and the Rhone Valley. Jean-Pierre, the imperious sommelier, began to find Julien's questions less annoying and more insightful. He started talking to him, not as a superior to a lackey, but as a master to a potential apprentice, sharing anecdotes about vintages and vineyards. The test arrived on a rainy night in March. It came in the form of Amelia Vance, though no one knew her name at the time. She was simply the arbiter, the Globe's food critic, a woman whose opinion could shutter a restaurant or grant it immortality. Her arrival, unannounced, sent a silent shock wave through the dining room. The night was already fraught. A key refrigerator had failed, and the kitchen was in a state of controlled panic. Eleanor was a study in grace under pressure, a calming presence in the eye of the storm. The arbiter's table was in Julien's section. He moved with a newfound economy of motion, his service unobtrusive and flawless. As he cleared the plates from her main course, a perfectly seared duck breast, he overheard her whisper to her companion, "The execution is flawless, but the sommelier's pairing, a classic Bordeaux, it feels dutiful. It lacks poetry." The comment struck a chord deep within Julien. He knew Jean-Pierre, terrified of making a mistake, would only offer the safest, most conventional pairings. But Julien knew the cellar's secrets. He knew about a case of an obscure, decade-old Gamay from a tiny parcel in Morgon that Jean-Pierre had bought on a whim. It wasn't prestigious, it wasn't expensive, but it had a wild, earthy cherry and violets character that he knew, with an instinct that felt like a bolt of lightning, would not just complement the cheese course the arbiter had ordered, it would elevate it into a conversation. He found Eleanor at the pass, her face tense as she inspected a plate. He spoke quickly, his voice low and urgent. "The critic, table 4, she thinks the wine is predictable. Jean-Pierre is playing it safe. I have an idea, a risk. It's not on the list." He told her the wine, why it would work, the story behind it. Eleanor looked at him. She saw the ghost of the arrogant boy who had once lectured a sommelier about butter temperature. But that boy was gone. In his place was a young man, his eyes bright with a genuine, unselfish passion for the craft. She saw the same conviction she felt when she knew a sauce was right. It was a hell of a gamble, an audacious, potentially catastrophic gamble. She held his gaze for a long second, a silent communion of shared pressure and nascent trust. "Go," she said, "but you pour it." Julien approached the table, his heart hammering. He presented the bottle not as a servant, but as a curator. He didn't try to sell it. He simply told its story of the stubborn old winemaker, the granite soil, the improbable survival of these old vines. He spoke with a quiet reverence for the object itself, for the work and time captured in the glass. The arbiter watched him, her famously severe expression softening with intrigue. She nodded. He poured. 2 weeks later, the review landed like a benediction. It was a love letter. Aurelia, the arbiter wrote, has been resurrected not merely as a restaurant, but as an idea that true luxury is not about price tags, but about integrity. She saved the final stunning paragraph for the end of the meal. The evening was capped by an act of stunning bravery. A young man, who I later learned was part of the service staff, suggested a wine so unexpected, so off the beaten path, that it bordered on madness. It was, however, the madness of genius. The pairing was not just a pairing, it was a revelation. It was a sign that Aurelia is now in the hands of people who do not just serve food and wine, but who understand it in their bones. That evening, Arthur Croft's car, a modest sedan, pulled up outside. He didn't sit in the main dining room. He asked Ellie to join him at the small staff table in the back, near the kitchen doors. The sounds of a successful service, the clatter of plates, the murmur of happy diners, filled the air around them. He slid a leather-bound folder across the table. Inside were the documents, executed and notarized, granting her a 20% equity partnership. "This was never about money, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him. "It was about proving that character is a more valuable asset than capital. You have proven it beyond my wildest hopes." He pushed a second envelope toward her. It contained a single key on a simple ring. "The building that used to house the rolling pin. The current tenant's lease was up. I acquired it. The deed is in your grandmother's name. A gift. For her and for you. For services rendered that can never be adequately compensated." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. It was too much. "Arthur, I can't." "You can," he said gently. "Some debts are paid forward." Then he called for Julian. His son approached, wiping his hands on his apron, looking tired but alive in a way he never had before. "Your trust is reinstated. Your assets are unfrozen," Arthur said, his tone formal, yet underpinned with a profound paternal tremor. "The terms of our arrangement are concluded. You are free." Julian stood there, the din of the restaurant fading into a dull roar in his ears. He looked at his father, the architect of his damnation and his salvation. He looked at Eleanor, her expression unreadable but no longer hostile. He looked around the room, at this place he had entered as a prison and had impossibly come to see as a purpose. The path back to his old life was clear. The Maserati, the penthouses, the sycophants. It was all waiting, and it felt like an empty, echoing tomb. "I don't want to be free," Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. "I want a job. I want to apply for the position of assistant sommelier. I want to earn it." Arthur Croft looked at his son, and for the first time in a decade, he saw not an heir, but a man. He nodded slowly, a single difficult gesture of acceptance and pride. He stood, shook Ellie's hand, placed a hand on Julian's shoulder for a brief, electric moment, and then he was gone. Left alone in the bustling aftermath of the service, Eleanor and Julian faced each other. The vast, charged space of their history, the sneer, the thrown money, the humiliation, was still there. It would always be there, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. "The cellar needs to be inventoried by morning," she said, her voice professional, but without the icy edge of before. "Jean-Pierre wants a full report on the new Italian shipments." "I'll have it on your desk by 9, he replied. He turned to go, but she spoke again. "Julian." He stopped. "It was a good call," she said. "The Gamay. It had poetry." A year later, Aurelia was a Boston institution. Eleanor was its soul, a James Beard Award nominee whose quiet authority was legendary. Julian was its palate, a sommelier whose knowledge was exceeded only by his humility. They were not friends. They were not lovers. They were something far more rare and durable. Two people who had been permanently altered by the same crucible, bound by a shared language of resilience. Their partnership was a quiet, intricate dance of mutual respect, built on the foundations of a profound and unforgettable insult. On Sundays, Eleanor would close the restaurant and drive to the North End. The faded sign on the old storefront had been lovingly restored. It now read, Clara's Rolling Pin. Inside, her grandmother, her eyes bright and her hands dusted with flour, would preside over a place that smelled of yeast, sugar, and memory. It wasn't a business meant for profit, it was a sanctuary, a place where Clara gave away more bread than she sold, a nexus of community that Eleanor had resurrected. Sometimes Julian would come with her. He wouldn't say much. He would just sit at a small corner table, drink a cup of coffee, and watch Clara work. He was watching a woman who, like her granddaughter, understood the quiet, formidable power not of taking or of buying or of owning, but of building. And in the warm, fragrant air of the small bakery, he was slowly learning how to breathe.